this is a little introductory. We are here today in Sarasota at the home of Dennis Plews, and the address is what is the address, Dennis?
6752 Stillwater Way, Sarasota, Florida 34231.
And okay, it's myself, Carlton Cartwright, the executive director for the Children's Coalition Incorporated, and also Colonel. What is your name, sir?
Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Connelly.
Okay, that's who we're going to interview first, and that's for the record. Today's date is the 9th of May,
9th of May.
2015, and I already said where we are. Colonel, when is your birth date and your current address?
March 23rd, 1940. Current address is 118 Dory Lane, Osprey, Florida.
Okay. And sir, what wars or branch of the service did you serve in?
I served in Vietnam for a number of years, and my branch of the service is United States Army.
Okay. And your rank when you separated?
Rank was captain when I separated.
Okay. But Dennis referred to you as a colonel, so I take it you did reserve duty?
That's correct. I stayed had about 4.5 years active, and I retired out of the reserves after 28 years service.
Okay. Great. Excellent. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was ROTC at Notre Dame.
Okay. And where were you living at the time?
I was living, my home address at the time was Huntington, New York.
And I believe you said you were drafted?
No, I was a volunteer. I was
Okay.
ROTC.
Why did you join?
A desire to serve.
Okay. Why did you pick that service branch?
Because I was colorblind, couldn't get in the Navy.
Okay. You recall your first days in service?
I do.
We're going to enjoy this interview. I can see that. Okay. Okay. Tell me about basic training, sir.
Well, went through ROTC summer camp,
Right.
and then when we were commissioned as second lieutenants upon graduation, I went back on an active duty in September of 1962, where I attended the Armor Officer Basic Course because my branch was armor. And I could be a combat line officer in the Army with colorblindness, where
Right.
in Navy I could not be a line officer.
Okay. 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 Well, how long was basic training?
It was about 3 months of armor training,
Right.
and then we finished the armor school, and I was assigned to the 4th Armor Division in Germany, which is arriving there in December of 1962.
Okay. You went in enlisted or as an officer?
Officer, second lieutenant.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Did you have any interesting experiences that you can remember while you were in basic training, so to speak? What was that? OTC, Officer Training School?
Well, actually, it was not officer training. We were already commissioned officers.
Okay.
We had been through ROTC Cadet, which was somewhat like a basic training.
Oh, okay.
Which was 6 weeks in our junior year of college in the summertime. Then upon graduation, we were commissioned as second lieutenants. Then we went on based on your branch, you went to the particular branch school. In my case, I was a tanker. We went to Fort Knox for armor training.
Okay.
On the basically training in the M48 tank and the M60 tank at the time.
Okay. And where were you? Where was your first duty base?
After Fort Knox, I was assigned to Erlangen, Germany, to the 1st Battalion, 35th Armor, as a platoon leader, and arrived there in December of '62, and took over the 2nd Platoon of A Company of the 35th Armor Regiment.
How long were you stationed there?
Just over 2 years.
Okay, tell me about it.
Well, what was interesting in the fact is that this is the middle of the Cold War. And all our tanks were fully combat loaded with full ammunition, main gun rounds, machine gun, fully loaded. And every month, at unannounced times, they would have what they called an alert. And the alerts could be at 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, any time during the day. and you had 2 hours to get aboard your tank and deployed in the field, ready to go to war.
Okay. Um, okay.
And the first time I arrived there in the January of 1963, I'm fresh new lieutenant in the unit. I get down there for the readiness test, and the word comes through. I radio in that my platoon is ready to roll,
right.
and I'm the first platoon ready to roll. So they told me to lead out. So I led out through the main gate with my tank platoon, not knowing where I was going. And I managed to lead the entire battalion down the wrong road.
Oh, okay. I see you've never forgotten that.
I've never forgotten that. But you've ever seen 72 tanks on a narrow road trying to do neutral steer to turn around and go in the opposite direction? It's quite a picture to see.
Sure.
Did not make friends with the captain or the colonel that day.
How many individuals were under your command?
We had 20 people in a tank platoon. I had 5 tanks and 4 crew members per tank.
Did you see any combat?
Not in Germany, but it was a Cold War situation, and then in the summer of 1964, they came out a call looking for people who would volunteer to go to Vietnam as advisors. Okay. Vietnam was a little brush fire war where 20,000 U.S. advisors were there in country. And so I put into it. Even though my tour of duty as an obligated volunteer was expiring, I extended indefinitely to go to Vietnam.
Okay. Were there any casualties in your unit in Germany?
No.
Good.
Because we were not in a combat situation. It was strictly training, but we were also some close calls where the battalion went on full alert. In fact, when John Kennedy was assassinated in November of '63, my entire battalion went on full alert, and we were told to stand by for orders. They didn't know whether the Russians were involved or what was going on, or this was a precursor to an invasion. So fortunately, things did not get out of hand.
Okay, well, go ahead and tell me about your experience in Vietnam.
Well, since I had volunteered as an advisor, they sent me to Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, and I was trained by the Special Forces for another 3 months into lessons learned of Vietnam, history of the country, the reasons why we're involved, and also then sent to 3 more months of language training to learn to speak Vietnamese. So in March of 1965, I arrived in Vietnam to be assigned as an advisor. And just as I arrive in '65, the lid blows off and the huge U.S. buildup starts taking place where there was only 20,000 U.S. advisors in country. Suddenly, by the time I left a year later, there was 500,000 troops in country. And they had switched it from a major effort of being advisory to major combat operations with U.S. line units. So when I got in country, I was assigned down to the Delta to a small remote province, out on a province near the Cambodian border, and I was to be one of 5 advisors in this particular district. Interesting to note, I arrived in this little town of Sadek, which was the advisory headquarters for the Delta area. And my captain comes over from this remote province upriver in a small little Vietnamese motorized boat to pick me up and my baggage to go to my new place, to assignment. And he's a tough old Korean War veteran, captain, OCS up through the ranks. And the big amusing thing was when you got into Saigon, stepping off the plane, there's all these Air Force types with ammunition drooling down dripping off them in all ways, and knives in their boots and ready for their jungle attack. And they're in an urban area of the city. Mm-hmm. I hadn't heard a shot fired in anger the entire time they were there. Then I get down to the Delta where there's a hotbed of activity. There's this crusty old captain coming to pick me up. And all he's got is a .38 stuck in his back pocket.
That was a contrast. That was a pretty high contrast.
So we take the Vietnamese boat back up to our district, which is about a 2-hour boat ride.
Right.
And we arrive in this tiny little mud hamlet. We're going to be they've got a little hooch set up where we live, the advisors live.
Right.
And as soon as they step on shore, bullets start cracking overhead. We're being hit. He says, grab your rifle, follow me. We're going out with the local Vietnamese unit, the regional force unit.
Mm-hmm.
So we went out there, and the Viet Cong, meanwhile, had slipped back, came back about an hour later, and the captain said, congratulations, you've just qualified for the Combat Infantryman's Badge. All you have to do is stay alive for another 30 days to get it.
Good news.
Good news.
Good.
So that started my year as a military advisor, and I was a lieutenant. I had a captain for a boss, and I had 3 sergeants. One of the sergeants was an operations sergeant, and 1 medic, and a radio operator. And the equipment we were operating with was essentially World War II surplus equipment, because that's what the Vietnamese were equipped with.
Mm-hmm.
So we had old World War II radios where our radio operator was Morse code qualified and with limited range. And we basically averaged 3 combat operations a week. We averaged 3 combat operations a week for the year I was there. And so that was over 150 combat operations I was on. And I was the only guy on the team of 5 men not to get hit. The rest got wounded in some capacity. Fortunately, none of them fatal. And a few hospitalizations, but they survived it. And the other amusing thing was when the first time when I got there, we're out in a rural area with my captain, and we were with the Vietnamese unit, and the captain turns to me and says to me, ask this Vietnamese woman, what is the road to so-and-so village? And here I am using my fresh new language skills coming out of 3 months of language school at Monterey, and I asked the woman in Vietnamese where this road was we were supposed to take. And she answered me back in Vietnamese, literally translated, I'm sorry, I don't speak English.
Okay.
So much for 3 months of language school.
Right, yeah. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
But my language skills improved over the year, because the problem with Vietnamese is that most Americans don't understand it. It's a tonal language. You raise your level of the tone of your voice, and you've changed the meaning entirely. I can say to you, you're welcome, Kum Ka Chi, level tone. If I say Kum Ka Chi, I have basically told you I don't have an older sister.
Okay. Okay. All right.
So
Learn something
you have to
every
watch.
day.
You have to watch your tones, because it's a tricky language.
Okay.
But I learned a great respect for the South Vietnamese people, and I truly love them. They were wonderful people. I'm alive today because they took care of us, and they really took care of their American advisors. And the sad thing was that there came a time in the war, which about a year after I left, it was that assignments down with the local people was not a good career move for an Army officer. The way to get promoted was to be with the U.S. line units, the divisions, the battalions, corps, and that counted greatly, but they were fighting the wrong kind of war. They were, in essence, out in search and destroy missions, disregard for the Vietnamese people. And the way you win an insurgent warfare is not with U.S. line forces. They come over there and, in spite of their best intentions, can't tell the good guys from the bad guys. And they end up making more enemies than they shoot, because they're indiscriminate in their fire, and they can't tell the good guys from the bad guys. The way you win an insurgent warfare is with the local people. You've got to get them involved in their own security. You've got to get them involved in their own economic development. And you can be there as an assistant and a help. You can't do it for them. You want to give them a hand up, not a handout. Classically, we'd go down to some of these rural villages, and we'd ask the villager, what do you want? They say, we want a school. Okay, so we came in and we used U.S. resources, built their school. And then a few months later, the Viet Cong would slip through and blow the school up. And the villagers would say, too bad, they blew up the government school. So we come back again and say, what do you want? They said, well, we really need a school. So I'll tell you what, we'll get you the concrete and the rebar and cement, and you build the school. Partnership.
Right.
And they did, and the school came out well.
Yeah.
And when the Viet Cong would try to come in and blow the school up, there's a firefight between the villagers and the Viet Cong because they're not going to touch their school. And what came most successful was we created what they call the People's Self-Defense Force,
Okay.
where we actually trained and armed the villagers. Because the Viet Cong operated essentially in squad-sized units, 10 or 11 men.
Mm-hmm.
And they would come into a village and terrorize, tax, steal money, take the food, grab the young men and impress them and draft them into their military. And they were defenseless. They would say, yes, you have the Vietnamese force ARVN unit or the regional force unit 10 miles away. How does it help me tonight at 2 o'clock in the morning when the Viet Cong comes through? So we helped them create their own self-defense force, which was incredibly successful and drove the VC out of the Delta entirely. Because every time the VC tried to enter a hamlet, there was a firefight. Because they wanted to be left alone and or they're tired of the terrorism of the VC. Mm-hmm. And the net result was the insurgent warfare was a brilliant success in the counterinsurgency. Brilliant success in the Delta area. And I'm told through other parts of the country it was a very much success. However, as you neared the border areas, like near the North Vietnamese border and Cambodian border, mm-hmm. security was less so secure because they were operating in more main force units up there, the North Vietnamese. They were operating in battalion and division strength, and they were certainly could overpower a small villagers armed with a few rifles. But that was where you needed the U.S. line forces. That's where you needed divisional strength, battalions, to fight those type of units. But if you're fighting a pure counterinsurgency war, you must get the local people involved in their own security, and you can help them with economic projects, helping them build roads, dams, bridges, schools, medical aid stations, and that has been very successful. But just to send a U.S. line platoon or a company, they can't tell the good guys from the bad guys. At the same time, the Marine Corps was very successful using what they call the CAP program. They would basically assign a Marine Corps unit, small unit, squad, or platoon size, mm-hmm. to a local village to help provide security for them. It worked, but the problem wasn't the villagers doing it. You got to get the people involved in their own security. Right. And that is the success that they need to understand. However, the problem is that our brass, our higher-ranking generals, are conventional thinkers, and they can only think in terms of large units and don't understand the basic principles of counterinsurgency.
Okay. Were you ever a prisoner of war?
No, I was not.
Good. Congratulations. Were you awarded any medals or citations?
The Combat Infantryman's Badge, because I survived more than 30 days and after being qualified under fire. Mm-hmm. To get the CIB, you have to be with an infantry-type unit and been in combat.
Okay. And
I also got the Meritorious Service Medal and an ARCOM.
Okay, and what did you get those for?
Just attaboy, being there, doing a good job, not getting in trouble.
Okay. Were you... Stop it. Were you involved in any battle planning?
Yeah, constantly with the strategic things.
Okay.
With the Vietnamese. Probably one of the most interesting operations I was ever on was when we took an entire regional force companies, 3 companies, all boarded 2-man sampans and paddled up into the plain of reeds, paddling for 3 days to become a part of a major blocking force of a major sweep. And to spend 3 days sitting in a 2-man sampan, actually 3-man in my case, because I was in the middle and 2 guys paddling behind and front and back of me.
Right.
Boy, I thought my rear end would never get any feeling back to it. Sitting that thing for 3 days. But as we got into the blocking position on the 3rd day, we got in position just before dawn to be part of the blocking force. Mm. And as I'm monitoring the radio constantly, and I hear a U.S. helicopter go overhead, it drops the red smoke grenade right in our position, and radio saying it's identified a Viet Cong position, identifying us, the friendlies, as the enemy.
Oh, wow.
So, and ready to call an airstrike in on us. So I got on the radio and immediately corrected the situation, saying, "You've just identified a friendly unit."
Right.
No apologies, but fortunately there was no airstrike.
Yeah. It was,
But if I hadn't been an advisor and hadn't been with that Vietnamese unit at the time, they could have been chopped up by our own people.
right. Right. Um, how did you stay in touch with your family?
Letters, basically communication, and occasionally exchanging little cassette tapes
Right.
and make recording.
How was the food? Did you have enough supplies?
Well, where I was, we ate all Vietnamese food,
Okay.
and I have to say that I managed to lose 40 pounds.
Was that good or bad?
Well, actually, it became between malaria, not malaria, but so much dysentery. It was really fun.
Okay.
It was the constant situation where you didn't know whether to throw up in the toilet and mess on the ground, or mess in the toilet and throw up on the ground.
Gotcha. Did you have all the supplies you needed otherwise?
We got adequate supplies. We basically lived like the Vietnamese. We ate their food, and which was pretty primitive out in the Delta. There was no fish too small they wouldn't eat, bones and all. And I used to lay awake at night dreaming of cheeseburgers.
Okay. Tell me about what was your take on the level of stress on from like 0 to 10 or 1 to 10. What was your level of stress like on average?
It depends upon the circumstances. I remember one night being woken by the radio operator. Said, "Sir, we're under a mortar attack." "Oh, all right, fine. I'll get in the bunker."
Okay. Okay. What did people do to entertain themselves?
Basically, the rural area, we had no electricity except for 2 hours a night when we cranked up a 2.5 kV generator.
Okay.
And we'd read for a little bit, but that was about it.
So obviously there was no entertainment or anything like that.
No, Bob Hope didn't come very far. Didn't come in, but
Sure.
Raymond Burr, the actor
Yeah.
from Ironsides,
Yeah.
he came in country and said, "Look, I don't sing and dance, but let me go out in the remote areas where the USO never ever goes." So they put him on a helicopter, had him visit very, very remote locations, and he came into our site, came in and had a cup of coffee with us,
Right.
and took a couple of pictures, thanked us for his service, and left. But I thought that was quite impressive. I thought he was really an upstanding guy.
How many different places did you travel while you were in the service?
Well, I had a very interesting experience because at the time they allowed people in country to take 2 weeks leave. So I went up to Saigon and went to the Australian Embassy and got permission to bum a ride on one of their C-130s going down to Australia, because there was no R&R at the time to Australia. It was in the mid-65, early 66.
Right.
And they said, "Sure, we can get you down there, but we can't get you back because we come back full."
Okay.
So I said, "Great." So I went out to Tan Son Nhut Airport on the designated day, boarded their C-130, and we flew down there and we spent one night in Penang in Malaysia.
Mm-hmm.
The second night we landed out in the middle of the Keeling Island group with a remote island to refuel, and then flew into Perth, one night in Perth and over to Sydney. And that was a lot of fun there. And then I had to take a commercial liner back to the Philippines and Hong Kong, and eventually back to, and have my own expense into Vietnam over a 2-week period.
So yeah, because the next question was, what did you do when you went on leave? And you just told me. Okay. Great. How did you get along with your fellow officers and soldiers?
Oh, we were a very close-knit team. It was a 5-man team. So the military regimentation was minimal. It was basically we relied 100% on each other. In fact, I did have one incident there. Since we had no electricity, our only connection with the outside world of civilization was a kerosene burning refrigerator that made ice, made cold. And the kerosene burning refrigerator was a primitive technology. I mean, you had to have the thing just burning just right, otherwise it wouldn't operate. And I got up one night in the middle of the night to notice that this thing was smoking. So I went out there and I dropped down there to underneath the refrigerator to adjust the flame, flame backed out of the burner into the fuel tank, which exploded, covered me with flaming kerosene. Well, the sergeant got to me first and said, "Drop the deck, sir," and I did, and he got a blanket and put the flames out. But my captain thought maybe I had some eye damage, so they called for a dust-off in the middle of the night, and I was flown into Saigon, and went into the 3rd Field Hospital. They checked me out, said, "You're fine, just some superficial burns."
Right.
But that was the only serious injury I took place over there. But later on, I came down with type 2 diabetes, was a direct result of Agent Orange exposure.
Oh. Okay. Do you recall the day that your service ended, active duty? When you were done in Vietnam, were you stationed at another?
Yes, when I finished my Vietnam tour, I was assigned to the U.S. 9th Division, forming up at Fort Riley, Kansas, which was being trained to go back to Vietnam. But I put my papers to get released from active duty, and word came through. And after I was assigned as a company commander at with an infantry unit in Fort Riley, Kansas, and when my release came through, I thanked them all and went home.
Okay, well, two things. So you stayed in the reserve?
Then I stayed in the active in the reserves.
Okay,
yes.
so where was home again?
It was at the time was Huntington, New York.
Okay, so what did you do when you went back home? Did you use the GI Bill after the service?
I got home and I went to work for IBM in New York City, and was thoroughly bored. And at early '68, late '67, the United States Agency for International Development was recruiting countrywide for Vietnam experienced people to go back as economic development people in the country. So I joined and became a State Department Foreign Service officer, and did a little bit of training in Washington and returned to country in June of '68 for 3 more years. But it was interesting. I was part of what they call CORDS MACV. CORD stood for Civil Operations and Rural Development Support. And what it was, they got smart about insurgency fighting. They put on this team a security element, economic development element, psychological operations, training, all on one team. So in this particular case, I was a State Department civilian in charge of economic development, and I had 3 Army captains assigned to my staff, and I reported to a lieutenant colonel, province deputy advisor, who reported to a State Department civilian province senior advisor. And the team, it was a brilliant success. We had no U.S. line forces in the province at all. It was all Vietnamese effort, and by the time I left in '71, we had total security. The Viet Cong were totally defeated, and we were driving to our district capitals at night.
Okay. Okay. And you did that in as a civilian, or?
I was a civilian in the last 3 years,
Right.
but interesting enough, I came back and I was with the State Department in Washington, D.C., and I get a notice from the Army that they're going to remove me from the reserves because I didn't complete the advanced course. I said, wait a second, I just spent 3 years in Vietnam,
Right.
reporting to Lieutenant Colonel, 3 captains working for me, when I was going to be kicked out of the Army Reserve for not going to meetings.
Right. Exactly. So you
So anyway, I wrote a protest letter. The Army agreed, fine, but you still need to get the advanced training. So I resigned from the State Department and went back on active duty for a year to complete the advanced course.
Oh. So where did you do the active duty at?
At Fort Knox again for the Armor Officer Advanced.
And what was your job there?
Basically, a student, as with among the 300 students, all taking the same course, all captains, mostly all Vietnam veterans.
Huh. Really? Okay. So when you separated from the service that time.
Well, what they call refrad, release from active duty.
Okay.
And I was then. I joined a reserve unit called the 77th ARCOM in New York, and basically I was on the division staff there in the G3 section.
Oh, okay.
And then later on, I got assigned by the Pentagon to become a mobilization designee, and I did all my active duty at the Pentagon, down at the Army Operations Center in the basement, which was real time. It wasn't just reserve duty. It was training situation. It was real world, and for 2 weeks I was in a real world situation, working with the active Army. And during that period of time, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel.
Okay, congratulations. Okay, tell me, close friendships. Did you continue close relationships with anybody for how long? And I would imagine you've joined some veterans organizations on top of that.
I kept in touch with my first team, two captains that were my immediate superiors in Vietnam, my first tour.
Uh-huh.
And one was a Raymond Veers, Major Veers, when he just passed on about a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
We would get together on a regular basis when he came down. He lived in Georgia. And I also keep in touch, very close touch, with Captain Thonius Robinson, who was a black captain, one of the finest officers I ever served under. And we keep in touch. He lives in Louisiana. When he got out of the Army as a lieutenant colonel, he went to teach at Southern University, I believe, which is outside of New Orleans.
Right.
And we keep in touch on a regular basis.
Okay. So after that tour, did you go back to IBM or?
No, when I left IBM in '68 to join the State Department, that was it.
That was it. So after that second tour, and then now you're doing your straight reserve time, I guess.
Yes, and that's,
what did you do for a living besides that?
After that, I basically become entrepreneurial in nature and started my own businesses.
Okay, and what do you do?
Well,
What
then I was I worked. I shouldn't say own business. One of the times I started a business, then I was hired by the Suffolk County, New York, as their director of their industrial development agency because of my economic development background.
Oh, okay.
And I stayed in that job for about 8 years. Then I got another entrepreneurial bent and started a housing subdivision, which we sold out successfully in '90.
Right.
And then, as things were doing well, I bought a boat, a 43-foot trawler, and I thought I'd take it a trip. I went down south from New York to Florida. And when I crossed into Florida waters, I fell in love with the state. And you moved down 6 months later.
Right.
And then got involved in more entrepreneurial activities. And presently I'm president of Apollo Sun Guard, which is a manufacturer of shade structures, which we sell to park and recreation departments, schools, any place where you want to have shade.
Okay.
And we're also involved with electric vehicle charging stations, and we sell them pretty much exclusively to the federal government, to the GSA for their fleet operations.
Okay.
We have a certain advantage as in our company, in the sense that I'm classified as a service-disabled veteran, and that gives us a little bit of a priority in federal procurement, which is very helpful.
Overall, how did your service experiences affect your life?
I would say overall very positively, because it taught me discipline. It taught me and a deep appreciation for other cultures, and having lived with these people, and a deep appreciation of people all around the world. I have found that regardless of what country they're in, we all want the same thing. We want security. We want good education. We want a decent living wage. And probably one of the greatest horrors to inflict on human race is war. And there's got to be find better ways to solving the world's problems. I believe that by working with our Florida Veterans for Common Sense, one of our primary missions is, besides having a strong defense, we believe that we also should be waging peace, which means we should fight the causes of war: injustice, poverty, ignorance, and we should fight those problems with the same intensity as we develop and secure for defenses. I find very, very disturbing the fact that there used to be the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, That was done away with in 97. We need to be carrying our message back to the peoples of the world in every various mediums we can, and educating people, and working on building schools, opening up their economies, removing the root causes of war. And when it comes to, if you look at the wars we've been involved with since all throughout the 20th century, and they could have been avoided, and not seeing the millions and millions of loss of life. But at the same token, it's a dangerous world out there, and we need a strong national defense. But let's pick our fights.
Is there anything you feel like that you haven't covered in the interview?
No, I think you've done a good job.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your service, and thank you very much for the interview, Colonel.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I can honestly say that I absolutely love the U.S. Army. I have never served with people of greater integrity and courage. And the wonderful thing about the service was they had your back and you had their back. You don't get that experience in the civilian world. The civilian world is more dog eat dog, and the honor and the integrity I met with the people in the service was incredible. And did it teach me skills? I use all the skills every day in my own company, running a company. The Army taught me that as an officer, I had a responsibility to the mission and the men. And if you accomplished one at the expense of the other, you failed as a leader. I carry that same mission forward as running a business.